A Future of Terrorism.txt Notepad window. Focus on future trends in terrorism as a conflict method that has survived and evolved through several millennia to flourish in the modern information age. Terrorism continues to adapt to meet the challenges of emerging forms of conflict and exploit developments in technology and society. Terrorism has demonstrated increasing abilities to adapt to counter-terrorism measures and political failure. Terrorists are developing new capabilities of attack and improving the efficiency of existing methods. Additionally, terrorist groups have shown significant progress in escaping from a subordinate role in nation-state conflicts and becoming prominent as international influences in their own right. They are becoming more integrated with other sub-state entities, such as criminal organizations and legitimately chartered corporations, and are gradually assuming the measure of control and identity with national governments. The FARC and ELN of Colombia depend on extortion, kidnapping, money laundering, and other economic strategies to finance their operations. Reports estimate that the FARC collects $500 million per year from protecting the drug trade of the region. 191 other examples connecting criminals and terrorists exist in illicit cigarette trafficking. Recent years have witnessed a significant increase in this type of financing for terrorist activities. Known or suspected Hezbollah and Hamas members have established front companies and legitimate businesses to cover an illegal markup system, conduct money laundering, fraud, and tax evasion. Additionally, United States investigations have directly linked Hezbollah and Hamas to cigarette trafficking and material support to terrorism. 192 The United Kingdom knows that the IRA uses these techniques too. Government estimates state $30 million in fundraising for these type ventures by both sides of the sectary and not active capabilities of terror groups. Terrorists have shown the ability to adapt to the techniques and methods of counter-terror agencies and intelligence organizations over the long term. The decentralization of the network form of organization is an example of this, adopted to reduce the disruption caused by the loss of key links in a chain of command. A network organization also complicates the tasks of security forces and reduces predictability of operations. Terrorists have also been quick to use new technologies and adapt existing ones to their uses. The debate over privacy of computer data was largely spurred by the specter of terrorists planning and communicating over cyberspace with encrypted data beyond law enforcement's ability to intercept or decode this data. To exchange information, terrorists have exploited disposable cellular phones, over-the-counter long-distance calling cards, internet cafes, and other means of anonymous communications, embedding information in digital pictures and graphics and sending them over the internet is another innovation employed to enable the clandestine global communication that modern terrorists require. 193 See the Cyber Operations Appendix for more information on terrorist use of computer technology to support their operations. Terrorists have demonstrated significant resiliency after disruption by counter-terrorist action. Some groups have redefined themselves after being defeated or being forced into dormancy. The Shining Path of Peru. Sendero Luminoso lost its leadership, Cotter, and founding leader to counter terrorism efforts by the Peruvian government in 1993.19. The immediate result was severe degradation in the operational capabilities of the group. However, the Shining Path has returned to rural operations and organization in order to reconstitute itself. Although not the threat that it was, the group remains in being and could exploit further unrest or governmental weakness in Peru to continue its renewal. In Italy, the Red Brigade's Brigate Rossi gradually lapsed into inactivity due to governmental action and a changing political situation. This ultra-left-wing terrorist group gained notoriety in the 1970s but had been effectively suppressed by the 1980s. In 1999, they resurfaced with the assassination of Italian government labor consultant Massimo D'Antona. In 2000, they murdered another labor consultant, Marco Biaggi. By late 2003, several group members had been arrested. Yet, the series of letter bombs were suspected as connected to the Red Brigade. Parcel bombs were mailed to the European Union EU President. Bombs exploded in garbage cans near the EU President's home. Letter bombs arrived at Europol, the EU's police agency, and a letter bomb arrived at the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. 195 Also, a decade after the supposed demise of the Red Brigades, a new group called the Anti-Capitalist Nuclei emerged, exhibiting a continuity of symbols, styles of communiques, and potentially some personnel from the original Red Brigade organization. This ability to perpetuate ideology and symbology during a significant period of dormancy and re-emerge under favorable conditions demonstrates the durability of terrorism as a threat to modern societies. Terrorists are improving their sophistication and abilities in virtually all aspects of their operations and support. The aggressive use of modern technology for information management, communication, and intelligence has increased the efficiency of these activities. Weapons technology has become more available, and the purchasing power of terrorist organizations is on the rise. the ready availability of both technology and trained personnel to operate it for any client with sufficient cash allows the well-funded terrorist to equal or exceed the sophistication of governmental countermeasures. 196. Likewise, due to the increase in information outlets and competition with increasing numbers of other messages, terrorism now requires a greatly increased amount of violence for novelty to attract the attention. It requires the tendency of major media to compete for ratings and the subsequent revenues realized from increases in their audience size and share produces pressures on terrorists to increase the impact and violence of their actions to take advantage of this sensationalism. 197. An indicator of this trend is the fact that terrorist incidents have been going down in total numbers since 1991, but the lethality per incident has gone up. 198. Chart 6-1 shows that the number of incidents began to rise in the early 1980s and peaked in 1987. Since then, the number of incidents has been declining. In fact, the years 2002 and 2003 have the fewest number of attacks during the 22-year period reflected on the chart. This is probably the result of both the war on terrorism and conscious decision on the part of terrorist groups. Fewer incidents with greater casualties appear to be the goal for many groups. This is not just the function of efficiency and developing skills, but also a tendency by the increasing number of religiously motivated groups to view ever larger casualty lists as a measure of their influence and power. An ideal example of this attitude was the use of airliners as manned cruise missiles to strike the Pentagon and World Trade Center in September 2001. Chart 6-2 shows the average number of casualties per incident covering the period 1997 through 2003. As can be seen, the average number of casualties in 1997 was 3.0 per incident, whereas casualties in 2003 increased to 20.5 per incident. The years 1998 and 2001 show a large increase in the number of casualties per incident due to two catastrophic events: the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 and the 9/11 incidents in 2001. These three events accounted for over 9,000 casualties. If the casualties from the embassy bombings of 1998 and the Pentagon and World Trade Center attacks in 2001 are removed from the data, as shown in Chart 6-3, the average casualties per incident in 2002 and 2003 indicate a significant increase in lethality over past years. There were no catastrophic events during these 2 years, but of the 413 incidents, 55 resulted in casualties of 30 or more. and 20 of the 55 resulted in casualties that exceeded 100. The trend to exploit available technologies and the desire for more casualties will probably accelerate the eventual employment of weapons of mass destruction (WMD) by terrorists. Documented uses of chemical Tokyo 1995 and biological weapons Oregon in 1,984,201 and Florida and Washington, D.C. in 2001 have already occurred, and as mentioned earlier in this handbook, Al-Qaeda has stated that it is their intent to acquire WMDs. Escaping dependence during the evolution of modern terrorism in the Cold War era. Even nationalist insurgent groups sought out, indeed required, a sponsor from one of the two competing ideological blocs. These sponsors could effectively influence the policy of their clients and exercise a limited form of control over their actions. This gradually shifted to a less rigid control as more sponsors, such as Libya, entered the field. The death of the bipolar world order removed both the motivations and capabilities of a large number of state sponsors. This loss of significant resources eliminated many terrorist groups, particularly those closely aligned with the communist bloc, and increased the costs for sanctuary and training for many others. 202 In addition, punitive actions against rogue states have gradually shut down some geographical sanctuaries and sources of support for terrorists. Although this can be temporarily disruptive, new players will replace the old. Groups based in Libya shifted to Iraq or Syria when support was restricted due to international sanctions and U.S. military action against Libya because of their sponsorship of terrorism. Similarly, Al-Qaeda shifted key functions from the Sudan to Afghanistan when U.S. action and diplomatic pressure were brought to bear in that geographical area. In response, terrorists have adjusted their financial operations to become more self-sustaining in their activities, resulting in greater independence from any external control. Terrorist operations require extensive financial support. The facility with which groups can obtain and move funds, procure secure bases, and obtain and transport weaponry determines their operational abilities and the level of threat that they pose. The international nature of finance, the integration of global economies, and the presence of terrorists in the illegal black economies of slaves, drugs, smuggling, counterfeiting, identity theft, and fraud have aided this new independence from traditional sources of sponsorship and support. This evolutionary development has inverted the previous relationship between terrorists and governments. 204 In the earlier relationships, the nation-state sponsor had some measure of control. Due to the ability of terrorist groups to generate tremendous income from legitimate and illegal sources, It often becomes a terrorist organization that sponsors and props up its weaker partner, the national government. For example, during the period it was based in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was running an annual operating budget of approximately $200 million, while their hosts, the Taliban, had only $70 million annually. 205. In addition to financial supremacy, Al-Qaeda personnel also provided much of the technical expertise the Taliban lacked. The only asset the Taliban had to offer was sanctuary and the advantages their status as a recognized national government provided in some countries. Although the explosion in terrorist income has been tied to the increasing involvement of terrorists in international crime, simpler support by the more traditional means of donations, extortions, and extra-legal contributions can be leveraged into significant sums through investment. The PLO is an excellent example of financing through legitimate investments. The organization managed to acquire sufficient wealth by these means in the 1980s, receiving an estimated 80% plus of its annual operating budget of $600 million from investments. 206. This allowed the PLO progressively greater autonomy in dealing with other nations. Merging identities, terrorist groups, and other illegal sub-state organizations are rapidly becoming indistinguishable from each other. The increasing role of criminal activity in financing terrorism, either in partnership or competition with traditional criminal activities, is making it very difficult, if not impossible, to clearly determine where one stops and the other begins. These enterprises include well-publicized activities such as drug trafficking and smuggling, with some terrorists, insurgencies, and even less reputable governments have been engaged in for decades. They also include newer, less well-known illegal activities such as welfare fraud, tax evasion and fraud, counterfeiting, and money laundering. Many of these activities are offshoots of terrorist groups evolving capabilities of false documentation and concealment of money transactions for their operational purposes. These activities now generate a profit for additional funding. Terrorists and criminal organizations are becoming more closely related as terrorists utilize criminal networks and methods to operate, and as criminals become more politicized. 207. As national governments fail, their ruling elites frequently criminalize the nation itself, lending their sovereignty to smuggling, money laundering, piracy, or other illicit activities. Their security forces may retreat into terrorism to hold on to what power or authority they can, and use terrorist groups to function in place of the official arms of the government. Successful coups often generate governments that immediately resort to terror to consolidate their position. This interpenetration of a criminal element into the government while government officials are seeping down to the terrorists' level is the result of governments feeling that legality, in the international sense, is a luxury they cannot afford, and perhaps do not need. They lack the resources to adhere to legalistic notions, and thus sink into criminality. The better funded sub-state organizations, terrorist, criminal, etc., infiltrate or supplant the government. Eventually, there is no distinction between the two as they effectively merge. The situation in Liberia at the start of the 21st century is an excellent example of this phenomenon. The development related to this is the emergence of gray areas, those places where no government exercises actual control, and any order is imposed by sub-state, usually criminal organizations. Militias, traffickers, mafias, and terrorists operate their own fiefdoms, either as coalitions or in various states of coexistence ranging from troops to open hostility. These gray areas may be ungovernable slums or shanty towns in urban centers, or rural stretches too far away from the central government for effective control. The future of conflict, whether you view the post-Cold War world with alarm or optimism, it is clear that there will be future conflicts. There are more unresolved international issues left over from the 40 years of the Cold War than from the conclusion of either of the two world wars. However, now there is a system to regulate the conflicts that will arise from these issues. Finally, the types of issues and the antagonists involved with them have fundamentally shifted. The nation-state system is showing signs of erosion in many parts of the globe, and a return to the days of mercenary chieftains and small city-states is already underway in some areas of the world. In this section, we will look at what will inspire conflicts in the 21st century, and what some of the differences from the existing pattern will be. We will then look at some of the resulting practical impacts on the use of terrorism against U.S. forces. Future conflicts. The world order has changed significantly. The number of new sovereign nations that emerged from the end of the Cold War rivals the new nations created after the two world wars and the retreat of the colonial empires in the 50s and 60s. However, not all of these nations are viable states, and most of them do not have stable leadership other than that of local ethnic or tribal strongmen. Many have significant problems aside from poor leadership, especially in the developing world. The most significant of these problems include disease, resource depletion, factionalism, disease, the incidence of newer pandemics, such as HIV/AIDS and Ebola are just now beginning to equal the lethality of older scourges such as plague, malaria, and other tropical fevers. The World Health Organization reports 1,000 to 3,000 cases of plague every year. 210, on the other hand, the 2004 United Nations report on AIDS reports almost 5 million new cases of HIV in 2003.211. Further, both HIV/AIDS and Ebola are concentrated in the developing nations of the world, where the metamorphosis of productive populations into invalids exacerbates the healthcare costs these diseases inflict. Particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, countries are seeing their populations decimated in their most productive years. Gene research and the field of genomics may help combat new diseases, but offer the potential of a two-edged sword. Although it may provide advances in healthcare, it could also acquire a perverse tack toward biological warfare with very specific infections and target groups. 212 Resource depletion. Those countries that lack the base of sufficient industrial or technological production to sustain an economic system fall back on basic agriculture and resource extraction. However, population pressure and lack of foresight encourage rapid depletion of finite resources. The result is further degradation of the economy, with nothing to show for it in the way of infrastructure improvement or alternative production. The establishment of a viable economic system to support the national government becomes impossible, and what factionalism? Many nations resulting from the post-colonial era are simply geographic fictions. They are reminders of an earlier power system on a map, lacking any sense of national or geographic identity, and driven with tribal and ethnic divisions. Africa is a particular case in point, with national boundaries being the result of colonial influences, not indigenous tribal identities. The tensions between factions and the attraction for a minority in one country to join with their ethnic brothers who are a majority in a nation next door is a destabilizing influence on many nations. Lacking the cohesive identity, other pressures eventually cause weak states to splinter or gradually pull apart. In a related development, non-state and sub-state organizations and power blocks are assuming military roles and utilizing organized forces in conflicts and terror tactics and socio-political conflicts. Major corporations, private security companies, and well-funded transnational terror groups have all played kingmaker in failed or dysfunctional states in the last decade. In some cases, parts of the world are returning to a pre-nation state condition as non-state actors, capable of challenging or disrupting governments and nations. are emerging in the gray areas. The inevitability of conflict because of the widespread instability resulting from the problems noted above. A multitude of small to medium conflicts are inevitable. There are two likely models regarding the fundamental nature of these future conflicts, and while they are not mutually exclusive, they emphasize different things. The first model is strategic in nature and holds that past conflicts have moved gradually upward and level from tribal to national to ideological struggles, culminating with World War II and the Cold War. The next conflicts will be between cultures. 213 This view predicts fighting along the parts of the world where cultures intersect, such as the Central Asian confluence of the Islamic and Eastern Orthodox cultures. The assumption is that wherever there is a line of engagement between two differing cultures, there will be conflict. In light of this view, the transnational network, like Al-Qaeda, becomes more than a fundamentalist religious terror movement whose goal of replacing the power structures in the historical Arab world with a new caliphate is impractical and unlikely. When viewed at this clash of cultures level, Al-Qaeda becomes a true transnational insurgency, fighting against imposed Western political ideals and alien social order across multiple countries and regions simultaneously. Stateless for the moment, much as the early communist revolutionaries before the Russian Revolution, these cadres hope to organize the vanguard of a religious revolution whose eventual success they consider inevitable. The second model predicts the failure of significant numbers of the current nation-states in the developing world, unable to overcome such challenges as depleted resources, disease, and ineffective leadership. There is no way for these countries to become viable. Unable to exert authority, protect their citizens, or control their borders, they are disintegrating. Many of these countries are splintering into tribal and ethnic factions that might coalesce into a new, more stable form, or continue to devolve through violence into lawless zones of minor warlords and bandits. 214 Regardless of which model more accurately describes the future, the most important occurrence common to both will be the blurring and blending of terrorists as we now categorize them with other groups that will resort to force and violence to achieve their aims. As discussed at the end of Section I, the expansion of gray areas and the criminalizing of what remains of the nation-state could likely render parts of the world essentially no man's land in terms of our currently understood international system. How changes impact terrorism and U.S. forces. Terrorism has generally seen success as a tactic and failure as a strategy. Many of the emerging entities that are rising to wield effective power in failing states are only concerned with the immediate tactical effects of their actions. They therefore look upon modern little economic activity is possible is usually conducted illegally. Violence in Northern Ireland. Terrorism as an effective mode of conflict. They can point to the fact that Al-Qaeda invested $500,000 in an attack that is estimated to eventually cost the U.S. government $135 billion in damages and recovery costs. 215 Considering that these figures do not reflect the costs of military and law enforcement efforts to investigate and destroy the organization responsible, the comparative return on the investment is even greater. 216 Since these emerging and sub-state entities are not parties to any established rules regarding the uses of force, terrorism and the use of terror to oppress are viewed as logical and effective methods to accomplish their objectives. The development of rules of war and the framework of international laws that attempt to protect the civilian from military action are irrelevant to these combatants. Thus, the expansion of word and to whom violence may be applied will accelerate, and the treatment of prisoners will rely more on the provision for ransom or retribution for mistreatment than on the rulings of the Geneva Convention. This is important for the unit leader and planner because the mind set necessary to operate in a completely chaotic, unstructured environment will have to be developed. This mindset includes the sobering, and for Americans, unusual, concept that their units may likely be the only order or structure in their area of operations. There will be no host nation government and perhaps no local government. If there is any government at all, there very well may be several, all claiming some degree of legitimacy, and potentially all of which could be hostile. 218 U.S. forces deployed in these environments will constitute mobile capsules of order and structure, but that order will disappear after they pass through the area. Although this sounds as if all future operations will be attempts to impose order or stability against sub-state adversaries, and implies that major conventional conflict is a thing of the past, there is another possibility. There are theories for using all of these levels of disorder, as well as economic warfare, information warfare, and conventional military force, in an orchestrated campaign against an adversary. This would be conducted as a long-term effort of undeclared conflict that might appear as amicable relations between the two adversaries, but with one pursuing the eventual defeat of the other through multiple simultaneous methods. 219 Forms of terrorism easily fit into this construct of overt and covert conflict. The arena of cyber war exemplifies the ability to impact on critical infrastructure and its disruption and damage to national security, economic functions, and U.S. military response. The effectiveness of this approach is in the costs to the victim to defend against multiple threats with no clear focus. Operational control over the various tools employed by the aggressor is not required, as long as the tools perform their role of relieving the adversary of resources and resolve. Deniability is maintained and diplomacy pursued to keep the conflict from becoming focused before the aggressor is ready. Although all manner of unconventional threats may be employed, terrorism is a key component of this strategy. On the practical level, what changes to terrorist operations will concern U.S. forces. As already addressed, terrorism will continue to increase in lethality. The acquisition and eventual use of effective WMDs by terrorists is highly likely. Terrorism is merging and combining with various other state and sub-state actors, further blurring the difference between criminals, rogue governments, and terrorists. There are several practical considerations in the evolution of terrorism that have not yet been addressed. These are concerns regarding the impacts and interactions of mass media, technological advances, urbanization, and illegal fundraising with terrorism. There is an increasingly technological and informational nature to all conflict, and terrorism is no exception. Terrorists will continue to cultivate their ability to use new and innovative technologies and methods of applying existing technologies to new uses. This is not to say that terrorists will go exclusively high-tech, but they will explore the increase in capabilities that technology provides, especially the synergy between simple operations and selective technologies to ensure success. There is no doubt that terrorists will continue to exploit information technology to enhance their operations and to launch cyber attacks against our IT systems. Terrorists will attempt to exploit U.S. vulnerabilities to information dominance. Casualty avoidance and the CNN effect are interrelated perceptions held by many potential adversaries of the U.S. socio-political situation. Most of our adversaries believe the U.S. is extremely casualty-averse, and that images and news of casualties will be easy to deliver to American living rooms. This image has been reinforced by the news media's coverage of casualties in both OEF and OIF. While this effect may be overemphasized, we should expect it to be a significant part of terrorist planning and targeting. In the techniques of the CNN war, terrorists were pioneers. 221 Since the terrorists prepare their operations around the desired media effect, they will always be out in front of the reporting. They will orchestrate supporting events and interviews to reinforce the desired message. Terrorists have well-established methods of presenting disinformation and false perspectives. The use of spin has become widespread and is relatively successful. Frequently, military reluctance to comment on ongoing operations in the media for OPSEC reasons can play into the hands of the terrorist, as there will be no balancing information from official sources for hours or days after an incident, leaving the terrorist message as the only one in play. Terrorists will exploit the vulnerabilities of new technologies to attacks or disruption. Terrorists have a great deal of flexibility in their ability to acquire new technology. The historical vignette of the Fenian Ramsey text box below shows how the application of innovative technology to a specific target eliminates the advantages held by conventional military forces. They also have the advantage of only needing to attack or neutralize specific systems or capabilities. Consequently, they can narrowly focus their expenditures on the limited counter-technology they need. Also, they can neutralize some advanced systems or capabilities through the use of innovative and unconventional techniques, such as the employment of suicide bombers. Modern high-technology societies are susceptible to a complex terrorism dependence on electronic networks, sometimes with minimal redundancy, and concentrating critical assets in small geographic locales can present lucrative targets for the terrorist. Ensuring redundant systems exist, dispersing critical assets physically, and creating buffers, firewalls, or other type safeguards can enhance defense and recovery from such complex terrorist attacks. 222 There are potential cyber-terrorism impacts here in relation to the U.S. military transformation. As the U.S. military increases its battlefield information capabilities, vulnerabilities peculiar to networks, such as overload, feedback between nodes, and destruction of key concentration nodes become available for terrorists to exploit. 223 Deception techniques exploiting our reliance on technology have already been used with some success. 224 When Osama bin Laden thought American satellites were being used to locate him, tracing his satellite phone, he had an aide depart from his location carrying the phone. Evidently, the aide was captured with the phone, while bin Laden escaped. The military will not be the only or necessarily the primary target of new strategies useful against leading-edge technology and organizations. The dispersal of key civilian infrastructure nodes into locations remote from the urban complexes they serve increases their vulnerability, and the reliance on computerized control systems to monitor and control these nodes increase their exposure to cyber terrorism. Participation and use of terrorism will increase. Individuals and groups that are not currently employing terrorism will adopt it as a tactic. and those that are employing terror tactics at low levels of lethality will become more violent. This is a combination of existing terrorist groups trying to destabilize the existing order on an ever-widening basis, and the previously discussed tendency of terrorist groups to increase the level of violence when not immediately successful. 225 Terrorist basing and operations in urban environments will increase. Terrorists have typically operated in urban environments, but the emergence of megalopolis cities in undeveloped or poorly developed countries with poor services, weak governance, and rampant unemployment and dissatisfaction has created a near-perfect recruiting ground operating environment for terrorists. Many of these cities have adequate international communication and transport capacities for the terrorists' purposes, yet have ineffective law enforcement and a potentially huge base of sympathizers and recruits. The inability of external counter-terror and law enforcement organizations to effectively intervene where the local government is unable to assert authority is another advantage. The advantage to terrorist organizations that use criminal activities to fund operations will continue to grow. Money is the great force multiplier for terrorists, and criminal activity produces more money than other strategies. The annual profit from criminal activity is estimated at 2 to 5% of the world gross domestic product, or $600 billion to $1.5 trillion in profit. 227 Terrorists are emphasizing criminal activities for their support funding because it allows them to compete more effectively with their adversaries and conduct larger and more lethal operations. Conclusion. This final chapter examined the future of terrorism, with emphasis on the integration of terrorism with concepts of world disorder and new forms of conflict. The evolution of today's terrorist into a non-state politicized criminal is an arena of growing concern. The merging of criminals, rogue political leaders, and terrorists into one collective identity, which operates to realize economic and political power, is a possibility. The United States will have to adapt to modes and states of conflict we have been traditionally uncomfortable with, but can now no longer ignore. Text: Future trends in terrorism as a conflict method.